fuselage shook. It shook with the kind of violence that strips the teeth from your jaw and turns your spine into a column of liquid fire. Flak rounds were detonating at 10,000 feet over the Rhine Valley, and every burst of German anti-aircraft fire lit the night sky in orange and white, the way a blacksmith's forge lights a room, sudden and merciless and impossibly bright. The Vickers Wellington, a twin-engine beast of duralumin geodetic skeleton and olive-drab canvas skin, was threading through a curtain of shrapnel, and the crew inside it knew that any one of those glowing fragments could end them in a fraction of a second. This was the Bomber Command at the height of its most brutal campaign. This was 1943 over Nazi Germany, and the casualty rates among air crews were so catastrophic that RAF statisticians had quietly stopped publishing them. 45 out of every 100 men who flew would not come home. Not eventually. Not after a close call. They simply would not return. The odds made poker look like a safe investment. And yet, in the belly of this particular Wellington, wedged between the legs of his gunner, pressed against the vibrating metal floor with his nose tucked under his paw, lay a German shepherd. Not metaphorically. Literally. A real, living, breathing German shepherd with a homemade oxygen mask strapped to his muzzle, his amber eyes wide open, watching the darkness outside the scratched perspex with the calm, measured attention of an animal who had decided long ago that wherever this man went, he would go too. His name was Antis, and what he did next would save the lives of every man aboard. The story does not begin in the air. It begins in silence, in the specific silence of a battlefield truce. That grey, frozen, awful silence that falls between two armies when both sides are too exhausted to kill each other for a few hours. January 1940. The Maginot Line on one side, the Siegfried Line on the other. Between them, the corridor of devastated ground that had been called no man's land since the previous war. The stretch of mud and wire and rotting timber that Europe had never quite cleaned up, because cleaning it up would have meant admitting what had happened there. A Czechoslovak pilot, Václav Robert Bozděch, was not supposed to be in France at all. He was not supposed to be in the war yet. But Czechoslovakia had been carved up by the Munich Agreement in 1938, handed to Hitler like a gift-wrapped package by men in suits who told themselves they were preserving peace. And Bozděch, along with thousands of his countrymen, had done the only thing that a person of conscience could do when their country is stolen from them. He had escaped, crossed borders, found his way to France, and joined the foreign squadrons being assembled there to fight back. He was a mitragliere, a tail gunner, a man whose job was to sit in the exposed rear bubble of a bomber and shoot at anything that came at him from behind. It was not a survivable job, statistically. He did it anyway. And on this particular January morning, his aircraft had been forced down on the wrong side of the line, and he and his observer had taken shelter in a ruined farmhouse in the dead zone between the two front lines, waiting for dawn, waiting for a chance to move without being shot. The farmhouse had nothing in it. Broken furniture, shattered roof tiles, the smell of old smoke and older fear. And then, from beneath a pile of collapsed masonry in what had once been the kitchen, a sound. Small, almost imperceptible above the distant rumble of artillery. A whimper. He found the puppy in a cavity beneath a fallen beam, half buried in plaster dust, thin as paper, his ribs visible under the pale fur, his eyes barely open. He was perhaps 6 weeks old. His mother was not there. She would not be coming back. The world had used her up, as it was using everything up in those years, without ceremony, without marker. Bozděch picked up the puppy with both hands, felt the tiny rib cage fluttering against his palms, looked at the small face, the long muzzle already showing the classic German shepherd structure, the ears still folded, too young to stand, and made a decision that had nothing to do with military regulations or common sense or the practical realities of being a foreign airman without a stable base of operations on the wrong side of an active war zone. He put the puppy inside his flight jacket, and when they extracted themselves from that farmhouse before first light, the puppy came with them. He was named Antis, after the aircraft that had been forced down, a kind of dark humor, a soldier's way of turning catastrophe into legend. From the first moment, the dog attached himself to Bozděch with the absolute, categorical loyalty that only a German shepherd can produce. It is not devotion in the ordinary sense. It is identification. The dog did not think of himself as separate from the man. He was an extension of him, a piece of him that happened to have 4 legs and better hearing. He ate when Bozděch ate. He slept only when Bozděch slept. When the man was out of sight for more than a few minutes, Antis would find the highest point available and watch the horizon with unblinking amber eyes until he returned. The other men in the unit noticed immediately. Pilots, navigators, bomb aimers. They were all used to the presence of mascots. Dogs and cats were common in RAF squadrons, informally tolerated, occasionally photographed for propaganda purposes. But they had never seen a bond like this one. Antis did not belong to the squadron. He belonged to one man, and through that man to the air itself. June 1940. The Germans were in Paris. France collapsed with a speed that shocked the world, shocked the military strategists, shocked the historians who had assumed that the Maginot Line and the French army meant something. For the Czechoslovak squadrons based in France, the fall of Paris was not an abstraction. It was an alarm. Get out, now. Before the Germans sealed the borders and the ports and the airfields, the evacuation was chaotic, desperate, the kind of scene that history books compress into a single paragraph. But that was, for the people living it, an hours-long explosion of noise and fear and impossible choices. Bozděch was one of those who made it out, part of the stream of Czechoslovak and Polish airmen and soldiers who crossed the Channel to England in whatever could float or fly. He brought almost nothing with him. He brought Antis. Getting the dog to England was not simple. Animals were subject to quarantine regulations. The British were serious about this. Antis should have been confiscated at the port, placed in a holding facility, separated from his owner for 6 months at the minimum. Instead, Bozděch hid him. The details of how he did this vary, depending on which account you read, but the essential fact is clear. He smuggled his dog into England inside his kit, inside his flight jacket, tucked beneath equipment, hidden from the officials who were processing the incoming airmen, and when they arrived at the base that would become their home for the next 5 years, RAF, East Wretham in Norfolk, Antis emerged from concealment and sat down on English soil as though he had always planned to be exactly there. East Wretham, a flat expanse of Norfolk farmland, big skies, the smell of aviation fuel and cut grass and damp English earth. The 311th Squadron, the Czechoslovak Bomber Squadron, was assigned here, and here they would operate under the RAF's Bomber Command, flying missions over occupied Europe, over Germany itself, night after night, in those heavy black aircraft that looked from below like mechanical ravens. Antis settled into the base with the same calm certainty he had shown from the beginning. He knew where the mess was. He knew where the control tower was. He learned the schedules of the ground crew and the timetables of the operations officers. He learned, above all, the sound of the Wellington's engines, the deep, syncopated rumble of the Bristol Pegasus radials that powered those aircraft. and he learned to distinguish it from every other mechanical sound on the airfield. And then he learned something that no instrument panel, no radar, no signals officer had been able to do reliably. He learned to hear the difference between the engines of his own side's fighters and those of the Luftwaffe. It started gradually. The ground crew noticed that Antis would sometimes raise his hackles and face a specific direction before any alarm had been sounded, before any radar contact had been made, before any report had come in. He would stand rigid, ears fully erect, and produce a low, continuous growl aimed precisely at the quarter of the sky from which the threat would eventually appear. At first, the men assumed coincidence. Dogs hear things. Sound carries strangely at night. But it happened too many times, too consistently. The dog was not reacting to sound alone. He was filtering it. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, that was the primary Luftwaffe fighter of the early war period, had a distinctive engine signature. The Daimler-Benz D B601 inverted V12, which had a particular note at operational RPM, a quality of sound different from the Merlin engines in the Spitfires and Hurricanes. Human ears could not isolate that difference in the general noise of an airfield. Antis could. He proved it operationally on multiple occasions, alerting crews to incoming German fighters before any electronic warning system had registered the contact. It was not magic. It was biology applied to war, the extraordinary sensitivity of a dog's auditory system pressed into service, and it saved lives. Word spread. The air crew of the 311th stopped treating Antis as a mascot and started treating him as a piece of operational equipment, which is a strange thing to say about a dog, but which captures accurately what had happened. They also started arguing about whether he should actually fly. This was the question that divided opinion on the base, and it was not a simple question. It was one of those questions that opens up, when you look at it closely, into something much larger and more uncomfortable. If you appreciate the history and the extraordinary bond we're talking about today, take a second to drop a comment below. Just say, Antis, and let me know you're here for these stories that never made it into the textbooks, because what happened next is something most people have never heard of, and it deserves to be heard. The regulations were unambiguous. Animals did not fly in operational aircraft. This was not a suggestion or a preference. It was a rule, and it existed for reasons that were both practical and humanitarian, or what passed for humanitarian in a strategic bombing campaign. An animal in a bomber was a liability. An animal panicking during a combat engagement could distract the crew at the moment when distraction meant death. An animal wounded by flak could create chaos in the confined space of a Wellington fuselage, where there was barely room to move at the best of times. The commanding officers of the 311th were not insensitive men. They were men who had themselves escaped from a conquered country, who had themselves lost everything to the Nazis, who understood as well as anyone alive what it meant to hold on to something in the middle of catastrophic loss. They understood why Bozděch needed this dog. They just could not officially permit it. And so the compromise that evolved was one of those arrangements that exists in every military, in every war, the officially blind eye. Antis would not be on the manifest. Antis would not be in the operations log. Antis, officially, did not fly, but Antis flew. He flew in the nose section of the Wellington, or curled between Bozděch's legs in the rear turret, or pressed against the navigator's station, and the ground crew who helped him aboard did not see him, and the officers who signed the mission authorizations did not know, and the whole thing operated on a collective agreement not to look too carefully at certain corners of the aircraft. This is what loyalty looks like when it collides with bureaucracy. This is what men do when the rules cannot contain the reality of what they are living through. Bozděch, for his part, made no secret of his terms. He would fly. He would fly every mission. He would fly in the worst weather, on the most dangerous routes, over the most heavily defended targets. But he would not fly without antis. He stated this clearly, once, to his commanding officer, and the commanding officer, who needed his tail gunner, and who was also a human being capable of recognizing a line that could not be crossed, said nothing, and the arrangement continued. It continued through the winter of 1940 and the spring and summer of 1941, through the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, through all of it. And every time the Wellington engines started and the aircraft rolled down the runway and lifted into the night sky over Norfolk. There were 7 men in that aircraft and a German shepherd, and the German shepherd wore, eventually, a small mask that delivered supplemental oxygen to keep him conscious at altitude. The oxygen mask deserves a moment. At 15,000 feet, a routine operational altitude for the Wellington on long-range missions, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is not sufficient to sustain a dog's consciousness without supplemental support. At 18,000 feet, which was sometimes necessary to clear defended airspace, it becomes genuinely dangerous. Antis would not have survived the early missions without intervention. Bozděch noticed the signs first: a heaviness in the dog's movements, a dullness in his usually sharp eyes, a tendency to lie flat rather than sitting upright when they reached altitude. He understood what was happening. He asked the ground crew. He improvised. The solution that emerged was a modified oxygen mask, designed originally for human use, fitted and adapted for a dog's muzzle with leather work, an improvised strapping, connected to the Wellington's supplemental oxygen system. It worked. Antis learned to accept it without resistance, the way he had learned to accept the roar of the guns and the percussion of the bombs and the violent movements of the aircraft in turbulent or damaged flight. He adapted to each new horror with the same essential equanimity, not because he did not feel it, but because he had decided, at some level below language, that these things were simply the conditions of being with Bozděch, and being with Bozděch was not negotiable. The temperature at altitude was another dimension of the ordeal. External air temperature at 15,000 feet in winter over northern Europe can drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Inside an unheated Wellington fuselage, and they were not heated, not properly, not in the way that would eventually be standard in American aircraft. It was not much better. The crew wore layer upon layer of electrically heated flight suits and heavy leather and sheepskin, and they were still cold. Antis had his own coat, which was considerable, the thick, double layer of the German shepherd, designed for Central European winters, capable of significant insulation. But the crew supplemented it. They wrapped him. They passed him between them on long flights, when one man's body warmth was not enough. There are photographs from this period, grainy and black and white, in which you can see the dog's shape in the aircraft, surrounded by men in heavy flight kit. And the men are smiling in the photographs, which is remarkable given where they were and what they were doing. And the reason they are smiling is obvious if you look at what they are looking at. The first serious crisis came on a night mission over occupied France. The Wellington had been tasked with a target deeper than usual, and the return route took it over territory where German night fighter patrols were active. The flak was heavier than the briefing had suggested. Several bursts detonated close enough that shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like gravel thrown at a tin roof, and one fragment, moving at several hundred meters per second, punched through the canvas and aluminum and found Antis. It struck his front left paw. The wound was real, was bleeding, was painful in the way that shrapnel wounds are painful, which is to say, considerably. The dog did not make a sound. This is the part of the story that almost resists belief, the part that feels like it has been smoothed by retelling into something more miraculous than it was. But the accounts are consistent. Multiple crew members testified to it afterward, separately without coordination. Antes was wounded. Antes felt pain. Antes was in the rear section of the aircraft, where discovery would have meant, at minimum, an emergency protocol, a distracted crew, and an immediate revelation of the situation to command. And so Antes did not cry out. He lay still. He kept the leg tucked beneath him. He waited. He waited through the rest of the mission, through the evasive maneuvering, through the second burst of flak, through the long run home over the North Sea, through the descent and the landing approach and the wheels touching the Norfolk runway. And only when the aircraft had stopped, only when the engines had been cut and the crew were beginning to move toward the exit, did Antes allow the sound to come. A single, quiet whimper, the first indication anyone had that something was wrong. Bozděch found the wound. The ground crew was present, and the truth was out. And for a moment, it hung in the cold Norfolk air, this fact of what had been happening. And then someone went to get the station's medical officer. And the medical officer, who was a practical man, looked at the dog, looked at the crew, and stitched the wound. He did not report it. He filed no form. He said nothing that evening that would create a paper trail. Sometimes the people who make the official systems work are the same people who understand when the official system should look the other way. There is a quality to certain moments of calm in wartime that is unlike any other kind of calm. It is the calm of the eye of the storm, the specific silence between two engagements that has a weight to it, because everyone in that silence knows what the silence means. On the ground at East Wretham, between missions, the crew of the Wellington existed in exactly this quality of time. They cleaned their equipment, they wrote letters, they played cards, they sat in the operations hut and drank tea that was too strong and talked about things that had nothing to do with the war. Football, music, women, home. Home, most of all. For the Czechoslovak airmen of the 311th, home was a country under occupation. Home was a place where their families were living under the Reichsprotectorate, under the Gestapo, in a reality in which everything that had been ordinary and safe was now contingent on the behavior of an occupying force. These men had no guarantee that their families were alive. They had no way of knowing in most cases, because communications with occupied Czechoslovakia were unreliable or dangerous or both. They flew, and they came back, and they sat in this interim space, and they did not talk about what they were afraid of, because talking about it would make it real in a way that the not talking kept at bay. Antes was the exception to all of this. Antes existed entirely in the present tense. He had no past to grieve and no future to fear. He had the airfield and the barracks and the smell of aviation fuel and the sound of the engines and Bozděch. He sat beside Bozděch in the evenings, and he put his head on the man's knee with the confidence of an entity who has no doubts about what he is or where he belongs. Bozděch would rest his hand on the dog's head, and the two of them would stay like that while the other men talked around them. And sometimes the other men would stop talking and just watch. And there was something in what they were watching that none of them could have articulated precisely, but that all of them felt. Something about unconditional presence. Something about a loyalty that asked nothing and expected nothing, and nevertheless showed up every time without fail. Is this the kind of story that moves you? If it is, leave a comment and tell me. because these are the histories that deserve to outlast the ones in the textbooks. And I need to know that there are people out there who want to hear them. In 1942, the tempo of the Bomber Command's campaign intensified. The strategic bombing offensive against Germany was being expanded, the targets getting deeper, the missions longer, the defenses heavier. The crews of the 311th flew deeper into Germany than many of their counterparts. They were assigned targets in the Ruhr, in the Rhine Valley, in the industrial heartland that fed the Nazi war machine. These were not easy runs. The Ruhr was among the most heavily defended industrial zones in the world, ringed with anti-aircraft batteries and searchlights and night fighter airfields. Going there meant running a gauntlet that took pilots from men into something else, something stripped down, something that operated on reflexes and training and, the crew would have told you, on something less definable than either of those things. The missions were at night, always at night, because the Wellingtons were too slow and too vulnerable to fly in daylight, and the darkness gave some protection against the flak and the fighters, but also meant navigation by dead reckoning and starlight, and the occasional lucky fix on a recognizable bend in the Rhine. The crews who flew these missions developed superstitions the way all people in dangerous situations develop superstitions, rituals before takeoff, specific objects kept in pockets, phrases spoken in a particular order. And for the crew of Bozděch's Wellington, the ritual that mattered most was the one that nobody spoke aloud, checking that Antes was aboard, not officially, not on any list, but present, wedged into his position, oxygen mask ready if they went high, ears already moving in that particular way that meant he was listening to the sky. The crews would not have said, if asked, that they believed the dog kept them safe. They were too intelligent for that, too trained in cause and effect, too aware of the randomness of shrapnel and night fighter positioning. But they would have said, and some of them did, say it, in memoirs and in interviews recorded decades later, that the dog changed something in the mathematics of fear. He changed what they were able to feel in those aircraft, flying toward targets that might kill them. He changed what they were able to hold on to. You cannot explain that with physics. You can only record it. The crash did not come as a surprise, not exactly. In a strategic bombing campaign with a 45% casualty rate, the question was never if, it was when, and everyone knew it, and they flew anyway, because the alternative was to not fly, and the alternative to not flying was to leave the work to other men and to let the thing that needed to be done go undone, and none of them could live with that. When it happened over France. The Wellington was hit. Accounts vary on whether it was flak or a night fighter, and the records from that period are incomplete in the way that wartime records often are, priorities being elsewhere. And the hit was serious enough that the aircraft couldn't complete its mission or make it back to England. Bozděch brought it down in occupied territory, in the portion of France that had been under German control since 1940, and the landing was controlled enough that the crew survived, but not controlled enough to be called anything other than a crash. They were on the ground in enemy territory with a damaged aircraft, no communications, and the absolute certainty that German patrols would be in the area. They split. They had to. The crews separated into smaller groups to maximize the chances that some of them would make it to the resistance networks that operated throughout occupied France. And Bozděch, with Antes, found himself moving south. South meant the unoccupied zone, which in 1942 was itself being progressively occupied, but which still had in certain places corridors of movement that a determined and lucky man could use. South also meant the Pyrenees, the mountains, the border, Spain, and if Spain, then Portugal, and if Portugal, then eventually England. The journey was not short, it was not safe, it was conducted mostly at night, and partly in disguise, and entirely on foot through terrain that did not care about the war, and applied its difficulties to everyone equally. Antis was wounded. The bore. Old wound from the shrapnel had partly reopened during the crash landing, and the dog moved with a slight hitch in his gait that would have told any observer something had happened. He did not stop. He did not slow. He matched Bozděch's pace through farm tracks and forest and the long, open slopes that precede the mountains, and when the Pyrenees themselves began, the real mountains, the vertical ones, the ones that had stopped armies and frustrated borders for thousands of years, he climbed them. He climbed them with Bozděch, in winter, in the cold that those mountains produce, even in spring, in the absolute dark of nights without moon, navigating by the stars and by the logic of which way was up and which was south. The Pyrenees, crossing by escaping Allied servicemen, was a known route by this point. The Pat O'Leary line and the Comet line had been operating for months, moving shot-down aircrew and escaped prisoners southward through exactly this corridor. But it was never safe. It was surveilled. It was occasionally penetrated by German agents. It required guides and luck and the willingness to keep moving when every muscle in your body was telling you to stop. Bozděch kept moving. Antis kept moving with him. They crossed the Pyrenees together, a man and his dog, coming down the southern slopes into Spain, and from Spain they made their way, through channels that involved sympathetic consulates and carefully worded documents and the specific kind of diplomatic creativity that wartime generated, to Portugal, and from Portugal back to England. The 311th Squadron received their return with the particular kind of relief that a unit feels when men it had written off come back. You do not celebrate too loudly, because celebration would acknowledge the fear, and you do not ask too many questions, because questions would require answers that nobody wants to give. You just welcome them back. You make tea that is too strong. You give the dog something to eat and watch him eat it and feel something loosen in your chest. You go on. Bozděch returned to operational flying. Of course he did. He was a Czechoslovak airman in the RAF, and the war was not over, and the men of the 311th flew until the war ended, because that was what they had come to England to do. Antis returned with him, to the Wellington, to the altitude, and the cold, and the oxygen mask, and the amber-eyed alertness that continued to serve the crew in ways that no instrument could replicate. The dog's ability to detect incoming fighters remained consistent, operationally useful, quietly acknowledged, never officially recorded. By this point, the crew had developed an unspoken set of responses to Antis's warnings. When the hackles went up, when the growl started, and the eyes fixed on a specific quarter of sky, the navigator would note the bearing, the gunners would shift their attention, and the pilot would begin preparing for evasive action. This cost them nothing if the dog was wrong, which he rarely was, and it bought them seconds, sometimes. When he was right, and in a combat engagement involving a Messerschmitt B F-109 at night, seconds were the entire margin of survival. The war ground toward its end. 1944 was the year of turning points. D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the beginning of the Allied push through Western Europe. For the Czechoslovak squadrons of the RAF, 1944 was also the year in which the question of home became real in a way it had not been before. Home was maybe coming back. Home was maybe a thing that could be returned to after all. They flew through it, the hope and the fear together, mission after mission, the casualty rate still horrible even as the tide turned, because wars do not care about narratives of progress, and men still died in the final months in the same numbers they had died in the beginning. Antis flew through it too. He was older now, 4 or 5 years old, past puppyhood, but still in his prime, and the missions had marked him in small ways. A slight stiffness in the mornings, the old shrapnel wound occasionally bothering him in cold weather, but not in the ways that mattered. He was still there, every time. He was still at Bozděch's side when the engine started. He was still watching the sky. The end of the war in Europe came in May 1945, and for the men of the 311th Squadron, it brought with it the specific complication of Czechoslovakia's political situation. Their country had been liberated, but the liberation was not simple. The Red Army had entered from the east. The political arrangements being worked out in Moscow and Prague were moving in a direction that the exile airmen, who had fought for the Western Allies, were beginning to understand meant something uncomfortable for them. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was consolidating power. The men who had served in the RAF were going to be regarded, in many cases, with suspicion. They had been too long in the West, too associated with the Western democracies, too potentially infected by the wrong kind of politics. This was not an immediate danger in 1945. It would become one, fast, over the next 3 years. For the moment, Bozděch returned to Czechoslovakia with Antis. He returned to a country he had not been in for 5 years, to streets that were familiar and strange at once, to the specific vertigo of coming home, to a place that had been hurt while you were away, and does not quite know how to readjust to your presence. He returned with his dog, who was the last continuous thread from the life he'd had before France, before England, before the Wellington and the Flak and the Pyrenees. Antis was the only thing that had been there for all of it, all of him, without interruption. The years in Czechoslovakia were difficult. The political situation deteriorated with the speed that communist consolidations typically achieved in this period. And by 1948, after the coup that put the Communist Party firmly in control, the situation for former RAF airmen had become actively dangerous. They were being arrested. They were being tried. Some were imprisoned. The men who had been heroes to the RAF were being reframed in the new Czechoslovak political narrative as bourgeois collaborators with the Western imperialists. Bozděch was not naive about where this was going. He had lived through the occupation. He knew what it looked like when a system decided you were the enemy, and he made the decision that he had made once before. When France had fallen and the Germans had come, he left. He crossed the border illegally, at night, as a fugitive, for the second time in his life, a man who seemed to be defined by exile, by the act of departure. He was not alone, and he was not, this time, without the dog. Getting Antis out of Czechoslovakia and back to England was a logistical problem of a kind that Bozděch had some experience with, having once smuggled the same dog across the English Channel. The details of the second crossing are less well documented than the first. The accounts that survive are fragmentary, and the people who helped along the way had reasons to remain anonymous. But the essential fact is the same. Bozděch and Antis left, and they made it, and they arrived in England for the second time, with less than they had had the first time, which had not been much. They were given shelter and support by the community of Czechoslovak exiles that had formed in Britain after the coup, and by former RAF comrades, and by the broader network of people who recognized what these men had done and what they were now paying for having done it. It was during this period, the late 1940s, the early 1950s, that the formal recognition came. The People's Dispensary for Sick. Animals awarded Antis the Dickin Medal in 1949. The Dickin Medal is the highest honor that can be given to an animal for wartime service. It is sometimes called the Victoria Cross for animals, and like the VC, it is not given lightly or often. The citation recognized Antis's service across 5 years of operational flying, his role in detecting enemy aircraft, his resilience under fire, and the specific, irreducible fact of his continued presence through conditions that would have broken most living things. He wore a small medallion on his collar after that, a bronze disc with a laurel wreath, and he wore it with the same equanimity he had always brought to everything, as though medals were simply another thing that people attached to him and which he accepted without comment, the way he accepted oxygen masks and cold and the sound of guns. He lived out his retirement in England, growing old with the deliberate, unhurried patience that large dogs bring to their final years. He became slower. His muzzle went grey in the way that dog muzzles do, starting at the nose and working back. His eyes remained amber, but the sharpness in them changed into something softer, something that looked, to the people who knew him, like reminiscence. Bozděch was with him every day, as he had always been. The household was modest, a former RAF pilot living on a pension and the goodwill of the exile community in a rented house somewhere in England, unremarkable from the outside, but containing this history inside it, this weight of years and miles and cold air, and the memory of engines starting in the Norfolk dark. Antis died in 1953. He was 13 years old, which is a good age for a German shepherd, especially one who has spent a significant portion of his life at altitude in an unheated bomber. Bozděch buried him in the Animal Cemetery at Ilford in Essex, which is a specific place, a real place, with real graves and real headstones, where animals who served in British conflicts are interred with the recognition that military service demands. The headstone is there now. You can visit it. It says in English that here lies Antis, who served with the 311th Czechoslovak Squadron of the Royal Air Force, who was awarded the Dickin Medal for his service, who was a dog of extraordinary loyalty and courage. None of those words are sufficient. They are the words we use, because they are the words we have, and words are inadequate to the specific quality of the loyalty that Antis demonstrated across 5 years of a war that killed nearly everything it touched. But the words are there, carved in stone, and the stone is there in the ground in Essex, and that is something. That is more than most of the men who flew those missions got. There is a way of thinking about the Bomber Command's campaign that focuses on the strategic outcomes, the disruption to German industrial production, the diversion of Luftwaffe resources from the Eastern Front, the psychological effect on the German civilian population, the debates that continue to this day about the ethics of area bombing and what it means to make targets of cities. These are real questions, and they deserve the serious attention they receive. But there is another way of thinking about it, which is to focus on the individual experience, on what it meant to be 22 years old and sitting in the tail turret of a Vickers Wellington at 15,000 feet over the Ruhr, listening to the guns of the anti-aircraft batteries below and watching the searchlights raking the sky, and knowing that in the next 60 seconds something might happen that would end your capacity to experience anything at all. At that level of abstraction, the strategic questions fall away, and you are left with something more fundamental. How do human beings survive psychologically in conditions of sustained mortal danger? How do they keep going, mission after mission, knowing the statistics, knowing what happened to the crew 3 bays down in the barracks, knowing that the mathematics of their situation does not favor them? The answer, insofar as there is one, has nothing to do with ideology or training or even courage in the conventional sense. It has to do with attachment. It has to do with the small, particular, irreducible things that a person holds on to, that they carry into the dark with them, that remind them of what exists outside the war, a letter in a pocket, a photograph, a name, and sometimes, in the case of a group of Czechoslovak airmen flying out of a Norfolk base in 1942, a German shepherd with an oxygen mask and amber eyes and an absolute, unconditional refusal to be anywhere except exactly where his person was. These are the things that kept people sane. These are the things that kept them human, in conditions specifically designed to strip humanity away. Antes did not know he was doing any of this. He did not know about the Dickin medal or the historical record or the generations of people who would eventually read about him. He knew about one man, and he stayed with that man, and that was everything. The simplicity of it is, in the end, the most extraordinary thing. Not the courage, though the courage was real. Not the sensory gifts, though those gifts were real too. The simplicity, the staying, the refusal to be anywhere else, in a war that scattered everything, that broke everything loose from everything else, that made exile the condition of anyone who wanted to live with any integrity. There was this dog who did not know about exile, because he had decided, in whatever way dogs decide things, that home was not a place. Home was a person. And he carried that home through no man's land and across the English Channel and into the belly of a bomber and over the Ruhr at 15,000 feet and down through the Pyrenees in winter and back again. He carried it all the way to Essex, to the end of a life that had been, by any reasonable measure, more fully lived than most. If this story has moved you, and I hope it has, then please, leave a comment. Tell me about an act of loyalty you've witnessed that defied explanation. Tell me about a bond you've seen that made you rethink what connection means. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. 1. Stories that the official histories don't quite know what to do with, because they don't fit into the categories we use to talk about wars and heroes and courage. Because the thing about Antis is that he does not fit into any of our categories, and that is precisely why he matters. He was a dog in a war, and he flew 800 feet above the flak fields, and he came home, and he stayed, and in the end, that is the whole of it, and the whole of it is enough. The engines over Norfolk are long silent. The Wellingtons have been reduced to museum pieces and scattered fragments and the occasional photograph. The men of the 311th are gone now, all of them, taken by age and time, as the war itself could not take them. But the stone is still in the ground at Ilford, and the name is still legible in the stone, and on certain days, when the light falls in a particular way on the English countryside, and the sky above Norfolk is the specific shade of grey-blue that it gets in October, you can almost hear it, a low rumble, far off, the sound of engines going out, and something underneath the sound, something moving through the frequencies below what human ears can pass, something that a dog with extraordinary hearing would catch immediately, and that we, who have only our ordinary senses, can only feel as an absence, a resonance, a presence that is somehow there, even when there is nothing to see. Remember Antis. Remember what it means to stay.